Some of you, or maybe many, might wonder why I'm now presenting something from Eastern Europe. The idea was, this is not the explanation, but when Veronique and me were thinking about looking at different local contexts of the crisis. But this is because I think if we're looking at Eastern Europe, we can see that crises in different phases happened there, and that many times austerity was used as a kind, or introduced as a kind of a response. And moreover, if I look at the program, I think that different aspects of these crises, which we are talking about in these 2 days, we can see also particularly in Eastern Europe, and the case that I will present in Bulgaria as well. I'm talking about the land grabbing, I'm talking about the rising of the extreme left and other aspects. Anyway, I want to apologize for not presenting here the actually planned presentation on austerity urbanism in Eastern Germany. Instead, I will discuss mainly austerity policies and its consequences in Eastern Europe, starting with a short review of the 1990s, when austerity was present but wasn't used as a keyword in political discourses. As I said, that might seem exotic at first glance. However, by highlighting the transfer and the implementation of neoliberal policies, I hopefully can demonstrate, and we can discuss that, if there are some austerities, or if there are some similarities to the recent austerity doctrine in Greece and other South European countries. Moreover, I will also have a look at the urban scale, in discussing some consequences of austerity policies and coalitions in the case of Bulgaria's capital, Sofia. In spring 2010, the Eurozone countries and the IMF decided to offer Greece the well-known austerity package, which included this bailout loan of 110 billion euro, along with a number of austerity measures comprising privatization of public goods, tax increases, big cuts in wages, and so on. At that time, I was in Sofia doing fieldwork for a research project on segregation. One day, I switched on television and listened to the news. The anchorman mentioned the Greek debt crisis and its austerity measures, which immediately reminded me of a so-called shock doctrine or shock therapy that had happened 2 decades ago. I'm talking about Eastern Europe's and Bulgaria's particularly path to capitalism in the early 1990s. In both cases, the term shock therapy became a buzzword for the so-called reforms that were presented as the only option to achieve Western-style economic growth. Already the term shock therapy indicates that this therapy would probably cause traumatic effects for the patient, the Eastern European countries. Moreover, this therapy, which was offered by different institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, but also different national and supranational governments, required proactive engagement by the patient. The Polish case is probably best known and best studied due to the public role of Jeremy Sachs, for example, Harvard professor, and David Lipton, IMF chief economist, who had been chief economic advisors of the Polish government, so the Darnush government, since 1990, January 1st, the day when Poland decided to introduce the Balcerowicz plan, in short, the shock therapy. In the Bulgarian case, the macroeconomic program, which is implemented in February 1991, was not less radical than the Polish one. It included price liberalization, fiscal and monetary tightening, trade liberalization, privatization, and a profound cutback in social welfare. However, it didn't work. It was a particular unsuccessful shock therapy, as many scholars call it. A shock without therapy, resulting in complete economic collapse between 1989 and 1997, which was also partly due to a cleavage among the political elite of the country. Some numbers of this collapse: the GDP between 1989 and 1997 dropped with a minus of 33%. Real income in these 8 years, minus 70%. In 1997, 40% of the Bulgarian population had an income below the poverty line. That means less than $2 a day for daily use. Let's have a look at how these neoliberal measures that were behind these processes arrived. Who were the major or some major agents of agenda setting, and what about the local elites, and also what about austerity? Similar to the current situation in Greece, Bulgaria received loans and credits of hundreds, billions, even billions of dollars by international financial institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, conditional on compliance with the harsh reduction in public spending and privatization of public goods. However, the agenda setting started earlier. Already in March 1990, Andrei Lukanov, the then-time Prime Minister of the Bulgarian Socialist Party, commissioned leading neoliberal economists of the Reagan and Bush administration to write a plan how to create a market economy, as they called it. These guys formed a group consisting of 31 US consultants, lobbyists and scholars. They visited Bulgaria for 10 days and then wrote a report of 600 pages called Bulgarian Economic Growth and Transition Project, which was adopted, and this is I think important to mention, by the Bulgarian parliament as an official transformation strategy in October 1990. This was the guy who was responsible, and I put it here because sometimes pictures tell more than many words. Although this 600 pages draft did not function as a blueprint, let's say, for Bulgaria's transformation, its recommendations have been highly influential, as one can see, for example, in terms of privatization strategy applied, the introduction of a currency board, which I will talk later on. Currency board is Währungsrat in German, which Bulgaria accepted in 1997, as well as for example, the introduction of a flat rate tax in 2007, which many other Eastern European countries have introduced. The same important recommendation goes for the harsh reduction of almost all kind of social welfare, ranging from food subsidies over pay rise freeze to the cutting of unemployment compensation. Moreover, these leading experts, these US experts, but also others, did return to Bulgaria in order to fund neoliberal Bulgarian think tanks, like, for example, the Institute of Market Economics, which has been one of the major agents also for policy agenda setting in Bulgaria. But let's return to this report to have a short look how the tone was met in terms of social welfare. There we can read the immediate task of social welfare reform is to permit Bulgaria to make the transition to a market economy while experiencing a deep economic crisis. During this period, Bulgaria does not have the option of maintaining the current standard of living. The standard of living is going to fall no matter what Bulgaria does. The mission of the Bulgarian government in social welfare is to ensure that all Bulgarians have enough to eat, a roof over their heads, and basic medical care, provided in a way that does not prevent the economic reforms from working. And the reforms then were also made in this way. Similar statements can be found in IMF, World Bank, or EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction. Even though it is not mentioned directly, austerity and the cutback of public funding is a major issue and has also become a kind of consensus among the Bulgaria's political elite since then. In the beginning, austerity measures were presented also as the only natural option to achieve Western-style capitalism and as the only way to get out of the post-state socialist crisis. Especially one of the major political decisions Bulgaria has made since 1989 demonstrate this consensus and the spirit of austerity as well. As I mentioned, in 1997, at the top of the economic and banking crisis, Bulgaria accepted a key element of IMF and World Bank policies and introduced a currency board arrangement. This currency board arrangement required strict fiscal policy and cuts in social spending in order to guarantee price stability and to lower inflation, which were the major problems for Bulgaria at that time. Like many other policy measures, it and this is was prepared by the so-called socialist government and later introduced by the so-called anti-communist government. This shows, however, the grand coalition behind, which we can also see looking at other policy measures in Bulgaria. A brief overview of the Bulgarian Currency Board shows that it is an institutional instrument supporting a fixed exchange rate, the Bulgarian currency lev to the German mark or euro, that has replaced more or less the role of the central bank. The difference to other, let's say, exchange rate regimes is that it's a long-time commitment. It's a kind of a treaty. In fact, it is an official treaty that still directs Bulgaria's economic policy until today. Strict austerity policy is a cornerstone of this instrument, as we can see also by looking at annual budgets since 1997. Economically speaking, it meant a shift from domestic-led redistribution of wealth to a foreign-led mode of accumulation. In other words, the currency board provided a monetary framework for the investment-led growth that followed later on. In fact, foreign capital, because the central bank was not able or was not allowed to distribute money anymore, foreign capital has assumed the role as the principal agent of economic development since then, as it is one of the only sources of capital inflow. Basically, the whole economy is depending on the FDI, as we also can see. As we can see from some numbers, maybe you can see here the growth of the amount always of the in different years, the amount of the foreign direct investments in relate to the GDP. You can see the boom years where the FDI was almost 1/3 of the GDP, and below you can see the role of the real estate, which was let's say one major issue of these FDI. Institutionally speaking, the currency board is a council that consists of 6 members from the Bulgarian parliament, the government, the presidency, plus a number from the IMF. This council is responsible for the currency policy of the country. That means it is responsible also for the amount of money that is going to be distributed, let's say. At the end, this means that the central bank, as I said, and the Bulgarian government depend on decision of this council, in which the IMF is part of. Moreover, this currency board has a veto option in terms of the national budget. So we conclude that that Bulgaria has not implemented only a strict fiscal and monetary policy since then, but at the same time has also given up a kind of political sovereignty by introducing it. Here I want to stop and shift the perspective at the urban scale. Here the implementation of austerity policy started even before, right after 1990. In terms of housing, which I have been studying, it can be seen by the dismantling, for example, of state-owned construction companies, the privatization of housing, the privatization of open spaces next to residential buildings, and the cutbacks of all kinds of housing subsidies. Of course, state housing construction stopped as well. The consequences are visible even though if one walks through the streets, for example, of Sofia. The urban fabric is quite fragmented, even at the micro scale, as we can see, for example, here by looking at some facades. It is a mosaic structure that appears also, which is due to the privatization of responsibility. This means owners or tenants decide individually to renovate their apartment. If they're not able or can't find an agreement, the building deteriorates since neither public funding is available nor exist public social urban policies except some pilot projects. So he's repairing also the Alpine workers, they're called. A more recent phenomenon of austerity urbanism in Sofia is the increasing level of energy poverty. Since the Sofia municipality has decided to privatize its water supply, which is now owned by Veolia, and the district heating company acts as a joint stock company, prices have increased dramatically. This has led to a new, let's say, practice. A lot of households need to stop heating, especially in winter times, simply because they can't afford it anymore. And they hope that neighbors won't do it either, so that at least some pipes remain working and the whole system can fall apart. Also at the urban scale, if we turn a little bit back now from these local images, the international financial institutions provided, let's say, the programmatic or ideological framework of this urban restructuring, as we can see in two World Bank publications that were published right after 1989. Within these two policy papers, the one is called Housing Reform in Socialist Economies and the other is called Enabling the Markets to Work. The World Bank described explicitly how housing markets and urban policies have to be restructured, privatized and deregulated, and a number of governments and municipalities in Eastern European countries followed these ideas. However, the influence of the World Bank and IMF and other institutions was not limited only to policy formulations. In order to support the intended politico-economic change, numerous projects and programs were initiated in Sofia, for example, as well as in other cities. In Sofia we can see it by looking at the city center renovation initiatives, the Sofia City Strategy, a strategic program for urban development prepared by the World Bank, which in some way served also as a cornerstone for urban development, and even as an alternative master plan, since the actually existing urban master plan had not been updated since the 1970s. Furthermore, there were other institutions which played an important role, for example, like USAID, who were, like, say, trying to support a kind of by fiscal decentralization. They support also a way of suburbanization and so on. The effects of this external expertise are also visible if one looks at the new Sofia Master Plan, which is working since 2009. This master plan argues for urban sprawl and also for a major role that private developers should take for the development, and they see it also as a way of catching up with Western standards or Western cities. But this neoliberal thinking, as one might call it, directs also the decision makers' minds, as interviews that I've also done with urban planners have shown it. Sofia's policymakers, as well as local authorities, have applied a vision that public interventions belong to the past and are outdated models of socialist urban planning, as I call it. This type of understanding of urban planning is included in different documents. Another aspect of Sofia's austerity urbanism isn't only a lack of engagement of public authorities in different policy areas, but at the same time a creation of new coalitions, even at the local level, as one can see by the public subsidizing of gated communities and private business parks, as well as other institutional measures that support private capital investments in some way. So, to summarize this little story, it can be said that this neoliberal restructuring of Bulgaria, which is of course more complex than I could show here, has been organized by a variety of austerity measures at different scales. But it also demonstrates the interplay between local domestic actors and key international players in arranging and managing these policies. And yeah, let's leave it like this.